So yes, thank you for the kind introduction and thank you for this opportunity to come here, discuss with you and also show some of my research interest at this moment. So as discussed, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki in forest sciences and also at the Institute of Atmospheric and Earth System Research. So the questions of how biosphere and atmosphere interact together. And lately my research has been done in the city, so I'm a forest scientist, but then I kind of moved in the city and now I study the trees that we share our day-to-day life with. So as we know, cities can be really nice habitats. We have the connection to other people and we have all the opportunities, but cities can also be quite stressful habitats for humans too. So we can have problems with pollution, we can have really high temperatures, especially during the heat waves, because cities tend to accumulate heat in their structures and in their impermeable surfaces. And then we can also have problems with flooding when it's a case of high rainfalls, because the surfaces, again, they don't let the water penetrate into the soils. And all of these problems also strongly interact with the challenges we have with the climate change. So if we have warmer summers, we have even higher problems with the heat in cities. And if we have higher rainfall events, we will have even more problems with the flooding. So these are things that need to be solved in a combined manner in the cities in the future. Another point I wanted to make about cities is that actually they have relatively huge impact in global use of resources and also in the global emissions of CO2. So even though cities comprise like 2% of the land area globally, they still use about 80% of global resources and they still emit about 60% of the global CO2. And this is based on UN Habitat reports. And on top of that, we know that the urban population is increasing. So I wonder if I can have a pointer. Yes. Oh, you will. We don't see it on the screen. But in 2050, we expect that actually the percentage of population that lives in urban areas will be approximately 80%. And what this means is that any changes we can make in the urban environment and in our management of these urban places can play a huge role in the global use of resources, in our emissions, and also the day-to-day lives of our global population. So, what many cities are doing to try and improve both the mitigation of climate change and the livability of the cities is use trees. And trees are great. They offer many benefits for the cities. For example, they can sequester carbon in their biomass. They can take up the stormwater through their transpiration, so the take up of water through the roots, through the stem into the atmosphere. And they can also remove some of the pollutants that we produce. And there are also more and more evidence of the direct effects of urban green on the mental and physical well-being of the residents. And that is why we see these kind of million tree initiatives in many parts of the world, like in New York, for example, planning to plant more and more of trees to have more dense canopy in urban areas. But while we do these kind of initiatives and while we plan on planting more trees and having more vegetation, we need to take into account that the same things that can be harmful for us humans in the cities can also be harmful for the trees. And they might not work in an optimal way if we just plant them wherever, in whichever manner. So we have these many different stress factors that can affect the tree functioning in the urban environments. For example, the soils are usually very transformed. They can be compacted, they can be covered by asphalt. So the trees don't have proper resources. They cannot get the water they need. They cannot get the nutrients they need necessarily. The urban heat and excessive lighting can be harmful, but also in some ways beneficial, because here in the north, the urban heat will also create longer growing seasons, so the trees will be able to benefit from the warm season for a longer time. And also the higher CO2, which is a global problem, is not a problem for the trees. They actually use the CO2 for their biomass, so for them it's good. So in total, we have this big question that what is actually the effect of the urban environment to the tree? and their ability, hence, to provide these ecosystem services like the cooling or the carbon sequestration that we are hoping to get from them. And lately there is this huge increase in studies about the urban green, urban trees, urban tree physiology. And when I did my postdoc in Montreal, I kind of hopped on that same wagon of, okay, let's study these urban trees, let's find out what's going on with them. So next I'm showing a couple of examples of things that we have been studying about urban trees, what it looks like, and then after that going more into my current research here in University of Helsinki. So when we look at what are the effects of the urban environment on trees, one of the aspects that we want to look at a lot is the tree transpiration, so their water use and how much they emit water into the atmosphere, because that is directly linked to their cooling effect, because that's how they can cool the air around them. And in this kind of meta-analysis, it seems pretty clear that the placement of the tree plays a big role in how the tree is able to transpire. So on the y-axis, the E is a transpiration rate of the tree, and then we see that the trees on asphalt surfaces, so like in pits on sidewalks, for example, they are able to transpire a lot less than trees that are found in parks in like grassy surfaces, for example. But as trees are trees, biology is biology, there is always exceptions to everything. And that is what we found in one study in Montreal, where we were looking at the sap flow rate, which is transpiration, but just measured from the stem, so it's the ascent of water, in 5 different species in street and park, so street in gray and park in green color, through one summer. And we see that in the beginning of summer, in May and June, yes, the park trees seem to be transpiring more. But then we see that there is this shift in trends towards the end of the summer when the environment gets drier. And actually the street trees are able to maintain their sap flow or their transpiration rate, while the park trees' transpiration rate goes down. So it seems that there is still some other effects rather than just the surface. What is the surface on which the tree lives that can affect their water use capacities. Here we think that it might be that actually the old infrastructures under the streets, so the aqueducts that are leaking, provide for some like water resources that are more stable than the water resources in the parks. Another thing that we like to look at when we look at how trees function is their growth. One, because it's directly linked to their carbon sequestration. If we have bigger tree, it's holding more carbon in its body. And for another reason is that it's really good integrative of how stressed the tree used to be, how much it had resources for the growth. And in some studies, people have actually shown, like in this example, that if we compare urban and then remote locations, growth of trees might be actually enhanced in the urban environment. And that is, in this study, I think the main hypothesis was that the nutrient loads in urban environment, because of the nitrogen pollution, are higher. So the trees are actually able to grow more. We actually measured tree growth within urban area, but again comparing street and park environments. And we were doing it by looking at tree rings. So the width of a tree ring tells us how much the tree was able to grow in a given year. So we were able to look back in time about the growth of these, again, 6 species in streets and parks of Montreal. And we were expecting, again, a bit naively, that maybe the street trees will be growing less because they have less space, they have less water, and they have less kind of everything. But then we saw again that don't trust your first hypothesis. And it seems that for certain species like the AS, which is silver maple, the trees actually enjoy being on the street and they grow much better. So there is still a lot to discover in this field, it seems. One reason why we might see these kind of species-to-species differences in how they respond to the urban environment and these kind of unexpected results is because trees are actually really good at acclimating and adjusting to their growth environment. They can change something about the wood anatomy. They can change something about how much they have leaf or how thick or big the leaves are. And in these studies, we have started to look at the structure of the wood anatomy that is related to the water transport efficiency or safety. So in this study, for example, they look at the vessel elements, and vessel elements are now these tubes in the wood that are responsible of transporting the water, just like vessels in our veins. And if they are larger, they are more efficient in water transport. If they are smaller, they are less efficient, but again, then they are a bit more safe in case there is a drought event. So in this study, again, they were comparing forest site and urban site, and they found that in the forest site, the vessel diameter tended to be larger, and also the vessel length tended to be larger. So the forest trees were more efficient in transpiring water and using water. But again, then the urban trees, they were probably a bit more protected against potential drought stress. So they had this kind of buffer in case the water runs out. We did a bit similar study, but again, within the urban area. So we had this gradient from urban street to residential street to park. And we saw similar kind of results. So when we move from the more urban area, so the urban street, towards the a bit more natural habitat, so the park, we saw that the efficiency of the water transport in the wood anatomy increased. And when we moved back towards the urban street, we saw that they were a bit more safe against drought stress. So some of these changes could explain why we don't see differences in the functions of the trees, because they are already adjusting at the level of their structure. So now, moving to what I do here in Helsinki, my idea after my studies in Montreal was like, okay, now we have studied these different processes of trees, different structures of the trees, in different species, in different cities. But we should start and put these things together to understand, like within one tree, what actually changes. So to measure these multiple different things in the same group of trees to find what is actually the thing that responds the most to the urban environment. What is the urban syndrome in a tree? So that is my current project funded by the Kone Foundation with kind of the same question. What are the effects of the urban environment on the tree functioning and their ecosystem services, and what is especially the most important change? So for the past summer, I spent a lot of time on the field, and I was measuring trees in streets, in park, and in forests. And my main species were silver birch and Norway maple, because they can be found in all these places. Also, Norway maple is really, really extensively used as the urban tree in all the temperate region. And this is kind of the roster of measurements that we were taking. We were measuring different traits of leaves, so sizes and thickness. We were measuring the transpiration and photosynthesis of the leaves, and also adding some fluorescence parameters. I will discuss those a bit later, so no need to know the word quite yet. And then we were interested in the water conditions in the canopy, the stem growth, and of course also the soil humidity to understand what is the side effect on the tree. We were also sampling these emissions of volatile organic compounds. I did not include more about them in this presentation, but just to know that they are these chemical compounds which trees produce as a part of their normal functioning, but they are especially prevalent when the tree is experiencing stress. So later on, I hope to be able to, through them, analyze a bit more what level of stress the trees were experiencing, and maybe the type of the stress too, whether it's biogenic or related to drought, for example. I will show a few slides about the results, but I'm warning you, these are really preliminary and many corrections need to be made for them to be actually comparable between the sites. So take this more as an idea of what I'm reaching towards than the kind of actual results that I will show like in a year's time, hopefully. But yes, the first step that I'm planning to take is then to just take these measurements and these variables that we measured and compare them between the sites per each species, so for the Norway maple and the silver birch. And these variables are now the two fluorescent signals, so the FEFM at the top and then the yield as the second one, and these both are indicators of stress that can affect the photosynthesis capacity of the tree. So when they are lower, that means that the photosynthesis in the leaves is not functioning at this maximum capacity. And so they are then a bit less able to sequester carbon. And then photosynthesis and transpiration rates are the second pair of variables that we were looking at, and the water potential at the bottom is a measure of drought stress as it's experienced by the tree. So when it's more negative, for example, in August for the maple, it is more potential, or it's more probable that these trees are actually experiencing drought and it might be harming them to some level. And then once that comparison is over, my plan is then to put all these variables together and try and see what is maybe separating my three sites, and are there some specific things that show up as the urban syndrome indicators. And from the preliminary result, it shows that maybe it's one of these fluorescence parameters that is actually separating the street trees, which are in black, from the park and forest trees, which are in green. And surprising way, again, the fluorescent signal, so the optimum or the maximum capacity of the photosynthesis seems to be higher for the street trees in comparison to the others. So we might be, again, getting some surprise results from this. Second set of preliminary results that I'm sharing with you today is about the leaf traits. And here the leaf traits were, as I said, different measures of the leaf size, leaf thickness, how much they have water, how much they have dry mass. And what I want to point out in this figure is that the site type colors are the same. So the dark gray is again the street. So for Norway maple, we seem to have consistently a bit different type of a leaf in the street in comparison to the forest and park. So they seem to be a bit smaller, a bit lighter, a bit thinner. So in all ways, just like smaller in size. And this could be the way of adjusting to the street environment, which could have less resources in terms of water, or maybe more mechanical damage or higher light exposure. Oh, wrong way. So once these results are ready, what can we actually then maybe use them for? Because this is quite applied research now that we are in the city, and this is not just my curiosity, but it's also maybe helpful for the future planning of the urban forest management. So hopefully they can help to identify some locations, some kind of site types which are especially stressful for the trees. And that could help to inform the tree placement, like in which kind of places we should put the trees so that they can give the maximum of benefits for us. And the management strategies, in which ways should we actually manage and help these trees to perform. And secondly, which is also as important, is that this kind of data from directly measured from the urban trees for the CO2 assimilation and transpiration will help feed these city scale models that try and understand the fluxes of CO2 and heat and find, for example, the hotspots of the heat island effect. So now, before going to the conclusions, I just want to point out the kind of big bias in this story. And it is just, I consider my site types to be like, okay, street is always a street and park is always a park, but that's of course not the case. We have a huge heterogeneity in the conditions, even in one strip of street, because we have transformed the environment so much. And for example, in this study in Kyoto, Japan, they were looking at how street trees were reacting to all these kind of small scale characteristics in their living environment. And they found, for example, that if there's a bike path beside the tree on the sidewalk, the tree's health will be probably better. So all these kind of small changes should also be taken into account when we think about then the optimal placement of the trees. So to conclude, yes, trees can help cities. I'm absolutely on board of increasing the canopy in the city areas, but they might also need a bit of help from us. especially in the planning phase. But at the moment, whether the net effect of the urban environment on the street is positive or negative is still a bit unclear. And where it is positive and where it is negative is one thing that we should pay attention to. But what I've learned so far in my studies in Montreal and here is that the street trees are not necessarily the most stressed ones, although that is kind of the knee-jerk reaction and the first hypothesis that we would have. And then there are two questions that kind of bug me that I want to go deeper into. And the first one is what I just mentioned, this small-scale variability in the urban environment and how it affects the trees. And are there some specific characteristics that we should avoid or specific characteristics of the urban environment that we should favor for the tree planting? And the second one is, I was talking about the capacity of trees to adjust and to acclimate to the living conditions. So I would like to know more about what is the role of this adjustment actually in the whole tree physiology and how they can live in the urban environment. So this is it for me. Thank you very much.